Introduction to Translation Studies. Origin of Translation Studies. Though the activity of translation is extremely ancient, stretching as far back as 3000 BC to the bilingual inscription during the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the discipline of translation studies came into being very recently in 1972. Theorization about translation up to the middle of 20th century didn't move much beyond binaries like translatability and untranslatability, fidelity and creativity, etc. However, later part of the 20th century witnessed immense development in linguistic and other language sciences in lockstep with the developments accomplished in anthropology, history, sociology, humanities, and philosophy. These developments brought about seminal changes in the way of approaching translation and led to the establishment of an independent academic discipline that dealt with the problems raised by the production and description of translation. Lefebvre, 1978. Rationale for studying translation. A multilingual and multicultural Indian context presents a fascinating context for the need of undertaking and examining the act of translation. India has 22 official languages and countless unofficial ones. Most of these languages have a written or at least an oral literary tradition. As Rimi Chatterjee puts it unfortunately, most languages are not perfectly comprehensible, even to the speakers of connate languages, let alone the speakers of a language belonging to an altogether different language family. National literature in India is thus separated by semi-permeable cultural and linguistic barriers. Thus, the need for translation is urgently felt in India, as it is one of the few efficacious ways through which a nation's crumpled state of affairs at various crucial levels can be straightened out to a significant extent, and an integrated mix of identities and assorted realities could be accomplished. Professor R.K. Agnihotri envisages the role of translation as a significant pedagogical tool in multilingual classrooms so as to serve several key purposes: treating underprivileged literatures and languages with some respect, enhancing linguistic and social sensitivity of learners, creating cross-linguistic, cognitively challenging tasks in the classroom. Translation as a pedagogical device can go a long way in deconstructing the hegemony of English in India, which has grown only insolently mighty and authoritarian after globalization. Further study of translation would again be instructive in as much as it brings out the process of evolution of literary traditions in a given language and culture. For example, with the onset of second millennium, Sanskrit was swept to the backwaters of theosophical, ritualistic, priestly, and pedantic usage and superseded by a fresh evolution of regional languages called bhashas. Epics, Puranas, and other literature began to be transmigrated into these regional languages by way of adaptations from Sanskrit. In his seminal book of Many Heroes, an Indian essay in literary historiography, G.N. Devi observes that this entire exercise of translating the language of spirituality served the dual purpose of empowering the ostracized and thwarted masses by providing them direct access to the literature of upper echelons and of helping the development of modern Indian languages. Scope of translation studies. Initially, translation studies was misunderstood to be heavily focused on literary translation, only excluding other forms of translation like interpreting and a rigorous pedagogical interest. However, translation studies covers into its research areas the study of non-literary translation, oral interpretation, and commercial processes like dubbing and subtitling. The first and a valid map of translation studies was drawn by James Holmes in 1972. Holmes compartmentalizes the discipline into what he calls pure translation studies and applied translation studies. The pure translation studies tries to explain the phenomenon of translation and further develops principles and parameters to articulate such explication. In other words, the interrogation of translation as a product and process is carried out under the name of descriptive translation studies, and theorization of these exercises in terms of principles and perspectives is undertaken within the bounds of what Holmes calls translation theory, both of which principally are segments of pure translation studies. Within descriptive translation studies, there are subdivisions that seek to understand the mental process as defining the act of translation, process-oriented descriptive translation studies, the nature of existing translations, product-oriented descriptive translation studies, and the impact or function of translation in the society and culture of target language, function-oriented descriptive translation studies. Translation theory, on the other hand, is divided into several categories in line with a variety of restrictions like medium, area, text type, rank, time, etc. These will be taken up for discussion in the succeeding modules. Finally, applied translation studies focuses attention on practical issues ranging from translator training, development of translation aids like dictionaries and glossaries, and translation criticism at large. Given below is the flowchart that Holmes provides to map the discipline of translation studies. Major debates in translation studies. Untranslatability. Attempts have been made by poets, writers, and philosophers and translation scholars to denigrate the activity of translation as impossible and thus futile. According to Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, language determines the worldview of the people that use it, and thus users of different language see and perceive the world around them differently. Critics like Derrida also negated the possibility of arriving at true translation. He brilliantly proclaims that since the quest for a single authoritarian and unquestionable meaning is will o the wispish, our attempt at pure and accurate translation is bound to meet with failure. In addition to this, aestheticians like Bradley and Bossuin deny the possibility of translation on the grounds that translation attempts to separate words from their meanings, which is absolutely impossible. Philosophers like Karl Popper and linguists like Noam Chomsky passionately upheld the cause of the possibility and feasibility of translation by invoking the uniformity in the deep structures of different languages of the world. Further, Walter Benjamin's The Task of the Translator provided a key statement in the universalist, liberal humanist philosophy of translation by privileging the act of translation as facilitating the release of pure language of humanity. Status of translation. The asymmetrical statuses accorded to the original and translation in West are largely due to the emergence of printing, which bred the idea of an author as the sovereign owner of his and translator as the inept and inferior thief. Alluding to the Christian myth of fall, exile and wandering, G.N. Devi has averred that in Western metaphysics translation is a perpetual exile, a fall from the origin. Andre Lefebvre designates such an essentialist misunderstanding of literature as corpus approach to literature which is indebted to the romantic concepts of a writer as a quasi-divine creator with peerless artistic genius, creativity and originality, and a translator as a drudge, a proletariat indulging into second-hand, second-rate activity of botching up the original. However, recent work in translation theory has exhibited a propensity to emphasize the transformative, transgressive, and interpretive elements in translation. Ethics of translation. Ethics of translation refers to the ideal manner in which a translator should undertake the translation of the source text. In this regard, Scalemarcher famously said that a translator could leave the writer in peace and move the reader towards him or behave the other way round. Out of these two, he recommends leaving writer in peace. As against this, polysystem theorists have evolved a target-oriented approach to the study of literary translation, which instructs the scholars to examine the historicity of translated text and the factors that influence a translator's choice of text and strategies of translation.